Welcome to the Urban Legends podcast, where we talk about legends that are urban. We would like to thank Mr. Little and Eagle Valley High School for sponsoring this episode. Today, we will be discussing the Bermuda Triangle and the stories and theories behind it.
People have feared urban legends like the Bermuda Triangle for centuries, but is that fear legitimate, and do these legends really have that much of an impact on us?
I think that is a great question, and that's why we're going to evaluate a lot of the circumstances surrounding the Bermuda Triangle today. First, let's break down what the Bermuda Triangle is and touch on some of its history.
While disturbances in the Bermuda Triangle date back to the early 1800s, it didn't become an urban legend until 1950 when E.V.W. Jones wrote an article about a series of disappearances between the Florida coast and Bermuda in the 1940s. In his article, he talked about 5 disappearances, starting with Flight 19. 5 bomber planes left the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale and never returned. 2 rescue planes were sent, but one of them never returned and disappeared with no trace.
That's crazy how, even with modern technology, they were still not able to locate any debris. I know he also talked about Flight Douglas Dakota, the Sandra Freighter, Star Tiger, and Star Ariel, which all disappeared in the same area with no trace.
Very true. They were also mentioned by George Sand 2 years later in an article where he talked about marine disappearances occurring in a, quote, watery triangle bounded roughly by Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, end quote. This was the first time the infamous triangle was talked about.
Man, it sure is fascinating how an urban legend can form over time. How was the name created?
Great question. It wasn't until Vincent H. Gaddis wrote an article titled The Deadly Bermuda Triangle in 1964. The phrase became prominent in popular culture in the 1970s when Charles Berlitz came out with his book titled The Bermuda Triangle, which was a major bestseller.
Yes, of course. I believe it was also that year that Richard Weiner came out with his book, The Devil's Triangle, which also became a popular name for the urban legend.
Definitely. After that, authors began publishing books with all kinds of explanations for the disappearances. Everyone seemed to have a different theory.
Speaking of theories, I would like to start with my favorite one first. Aliens.
Oh my god.
This one is a little more outrageous than some, but is pretty common. Basically, aliens abduct the crew of ships and planes in this area because it is fairly isolated, making it an easy target. Some even think that extraterrestrials have a base underwater in the Bermuda Triangle.
No way they believe that.
Yup. Some even claim that Christopher Columbus saw aliens when he described strange lights while traveling to the New World.
That's wild. But another kind of space-related theory I've heard is that the disappearances are a result of wormholes.
Wormholes?
Yeah, so basically, they're saying that the reason these ships are disappearing is because they're getting sucked into these time portals and these crews are traveling through time.
So, what if all the men on Flight 19 are just hanging out in like the 1300s?
Maybe, but I highly doubt it.
Anyways, I've also heard that supposedly Atlantis lies below the Bermuda Triangle.
So, what does Atlantis have to do with plane crashes?
Well, people claim that some of the leftover crystal energies are now sinking planes and ships.
I see. Well, I read that some people think that the weather conditions in the Bermuda Triangle might just be more dangerous than in other areas. Like there might be more tidal waves, hurricanes, and water tornadoes.
That might explain ship disappearances, but what about planes?
They claim that these water tornadoes are just plucking low-flying planes out of the air.
But wouldn't we be able to detect these weather problems?
You would think.
People also think that there could be pockets of methane gas in the area that are sinking ships and planes.
But isn't there methane, everywhere?
Yup, that's the problem with the theory. Methane is known to exist naturally all over the world, and this doesn't happen anywhere else, so that kind of debunks that.
People also used to put the blame on compasses that would sometimes point to the magnetic north instead of the true north, but that has also since been debunked because that doesn't happen anymore with modern compasses.
Yeah, as interesting as these theories are, there's also a lot of skeptics out there that think any disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle are simply by chance. They think that it is probably the result of a lot of human error rather than some mythical force.
Plus, it's probably a pretty high volume area, isn't it?
Yeah, it is possible that the reason there are so many disappearances is that there are simply more people traveling through every day. Plus, there are plenty of ships and planes that pass without incident.
These sound like pretty reasonable explanations, so the real question here is, why do people feel the need to come up with so many theories, and why do people keep talking about it?
Well, I think that, for the most part, the Bermuda Triangle, along with other urban legends, are manifestations of people's fears. Like we talked about before, in articles about these supposed phenomenons, authors would use people's fears in order to get attention and a response.
I think people might also rely on these urban legends today in order to legitimize their fears, you know? Like Bigfoot might represent a fear of the woods, the Loch Ness Monster a fear of the deep sea, and the Bermuda Triangle a fear of flying or sailing.
So these legends give people a reason to be afraid, so they don't feel irrational about their fears.
Exactly. Someone's fear of flying could feel much more justified if some mythical force...
Like aliens?
Sure, like aliens. But they feel more justified if some force could make something go wrong when they're traveling.
I definitely think you're right about this.
Of course I am.
But that's all the time we have left. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Urban Legends.